Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. Coral Gables, Florida. A quiet August night in 2004 fractures without warning. Within minutes, first responders are standing inside a well-kept home that shows order, not panic. One of Miami's respected civil attorneys, John Sutton, is alive but catastrophically injured. His wife, Susan Sutton, does not survive. This is not the debris field of a burglary gone wrong. It looks like selection. Someone chose this house, this room, this time. The first response unfolds by the book. Patrol arrives, establishes a perimeter, and confirms no active threat. EMS moves with urgency. John is stabilized and transported. Detectives step in as the medical team clears the threshold. Baseline photography begins. Wide shots, then mediums, then tight details. Entry points are inspected in a fixed order. Doors and windows show no pry marks, glass is intact, latches are documented. The sliding door draws attention. No splinters, no tool scars. It's a plausible access path without force. In scenes like this, silent details speak louder than broken locks. The house reads as lived in, not staged. Valuables are in plain view. Drawers aren't dumped. Electronics remain. Evidence markers drop next to spent casings on a predictable path from the bedroom outward. Trajectory rods confirm what the room already suggests. Close, indoor firing with purpose. Shots meant to end a life, not scatter a family into surrender. No one appears to have chased valuables. Someone came for people. A working clock starts as soon as the lens caps come off. Within minutes, the lead detective orders a tight timeline. The precise minute the call hit 911, the minute the first unit acknowledged, the minute EMS crossed the threshold, the minute the scene was locked down. Those timestamps will later align with phone records, sector hits, and interview statements. The order is intentional. When the narrative of a crime can be told only once, it has to be told in sequence. The canvas begins door to door along the block. Neighbors describe what they did or did not hear. A series of pops, not a crash. A sudden silence after. No one reports a getaway car squealing, no alarm wailing into the night. A quiet street stayed quiet. Too quiet for opportunistic theft. The anomaly is the violence itself. Inside, the documentation stays clinical. Measurements are taken from immovable reference points. Furniture placement is recorded, not interpreted. Technicians collect projectiles and casings using clean forceps and labeled envelopes. Chain of custody starts immediately, each signature legible. The master bedroom, the hall, and the path to the slider form an evidence corridor. There is no description here of trauma for effect. This is a record for court, not a script for shock. By early hours, a preliminary scene assessment reaches a narrow conclusion. This was a targeted shooting in a private residence with no reliable indicators of theft or forced entry. The absence of pried wood and shattered lock sets is not a gap in the story. It is the story. Whoever entered either had access, found access, or expected access. In affluent suburbs like Coral Gables, that difference matters. It separates random risk from calculated intent. The investigative center of gravity shifts from the room to the people tied to it. Detectives pivot to the immediate circle: family, colleagues, social contacts. Names are logged for interviews. Relationships are mapped, not judged. A professional partner will be among the earliest interviews, as will those closest to the family's daily routine. The victimology starts now, even before lab results. Who they were, who they trusted, who might harbor grievance. The point is not to accuse, it's to narrow. Technically, the case also moves to a 2004 toolkit. There is no GPS trail to rewind. There are call records and cell site sector hits, and they will matter. Subpoenas will pull the times, durations, and patterns that either matter or mislead. Analysts will look for compression around the event window, the cluster of calls that spike before a crime and vanish after. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. Patterns can look persuasive before they are proved. As the sun edges in, the command log is solid, scene secured, evidence inventoried, medical outcomes documented. John is alive but will never see again. Susan is pronounced at the home. That single fact gives the case its weight. A family's future diverged in minutes, and the record must make that time visible for a jury that will never stand in this room. For viewers hearing this as a case report rather than a headline, here's the practical meaning. A residence with no forced entry and no missing valuables narrows motive faster than almost any other early fact. It does not answer who, but it constrains why. That constraint drives the next steps: interviews that test alibis, scene facts that test stories, and phone records that test time. There is a temptation in high-profile crimes to speculate early. This report won't. Each claim in this case will walk in under evidence. Physical items with clean custody, digital logs authenticated by records custodians, and sworn statements placed under oath. Emotion belongs to the family and community. Procedure belongs to the case. Detectives close the first cycle of the night by splitting tasks. One team continues interviews on the block, another drafts the first subpoenas, a third inventories the last items and signs seals over scene doors. The home will not be re-entered without fresh authority. When the tape goes up and the lights go off, the case doesn't pause. It changes rooms from a bedroom to a briefing table where names and times start to intersect. If you live in a place like this, where lawns are perfect and nights are quiet, a homicide doesn't just break the peace. It argues with it. The question isn't only what happened, it's who had reason to bring precision into someone else's bedroom. The answer will not come from a hunch. It will come from casings, calls, and contradictions that cannot be reconciled any other way. The Sutton residence in Coral Gables was not a crime scene filled with chaos. It was precise, almost clinical. Investigators worked room by room, documenting angles, distances, and every item within sight. The master bedroom was the point of violence. John and Susan Sutton had retired for the night. Susan never made it out. John, though gravely wounded, would survive, but with irreversible blindness. Detectives noted the positioning of bodies, the resting place of shell casings, and the trajectory marks lining the bedroom walls. These details formed the skeleton of the case. Ballistics evidence began at once. Each casing was measured, bagged, and tagged. Early analysis indicated a semi-automatic handgun. The grouping of the casings suggested controlled bursts, not random discharge. That meant the shooter understood their weapon. The angle of fire pointed toward an entry from the hallway, not a confrontation face-to-face. This mattered. It implied stealth and planning. There were quiet anomalies here. The sliding door to the patio showed no visible force, yet it was unlocked. The living room showed no disruption. Jewelry on the dresser remained. Cash in the study drawer was untouched. These negative indicators, no forced entry, no burglary signature, were logged as carefully as physical evidence. Detectives are trained to see absence as data. The forensic team used trajectory rods to confirm what their eyes already suggested. Shots fired from mid-level height, consistent with an adult male. Impact patterns showed Susan had been struck while lying in bed. John had turned, possibly roused by sound, when he was shot. The precision and timing ruled out panic or improvisation. Whoever entered had intent. Beyond the physical evidence, the room itself told a story of intimacy. This was not a staged crime, not a stranger ransacking rooms in search of quick valuables. It was personal. In forensic terms, the scene behavior leaned toward targeted violence rather than opportunistic crime. In human terms, it suggested someone came to silence, not to steal. Officers extended the search through the rest of the home. They documented shoe prints, checked for fingerprints, dusted smooth surfaces. Initial sweeps yielded smudges but no clear lifts. That, too, became part of the negative evidence file. No identifiable prints belonging to an intruder. The absence of forced entry, paired with the absence of clear prints, suggested gloves or preparation. Meanwhile, the medical examiner's preliminary assessment began with Susan. The autopsy later confirmed multiple gunshot wounds as cause of death, consistent with casings recovered. For John, doctors stabilized him at the hospital, but law enforcement noted every detail of his injuries. His survival made him both the key witness and a fragile source. Investigators then looked outward. What about neighbors? Did anyone see movement by the patio or driveway? Witness canvassing again produced little. Some heard sharp pops, but none saw a figure enter or leave. Coral Gables is a place where nights are quiet, and that quiet worked against the case. Absence of witnesses, absence of prints, absence of forced entry. Too clean, too deliberate. Detectives knew they needed to move beyond the physical space. The home gave them structure, where shots were fired, how the intruder entered, what was left untouched, but it did not give them who. That answer would require a shift, from rooms to records, from casings to call logs. In towns like Coral Gables, Murders aren't just crimes. They rupture the illusion of safety. A gated house, a respected attorney, a family in their own bedroom. And yet, within minutes, everything had been rewritten by violence. By the third day of the investigation, Coral Gables detectives understood the limits of physical evidence. The Sutton home gave them structure, casings, trajectories, absence of forced entry, but no suspect. To move forward, they shifted to digital traces and financial records, the kind of data that often reveals what people conceal in person. In 2004, this meant combing through call records, cell site data, and bank statements. There was no GPS, no smartphone tracking. Investigators had to rely on towers, logs, and the paper trail of transactions. The first step was a deep dive into John and Susan Sutton's financial background. John, a successful attorney, had recently secured a multi-million-dollar settlement. That victory meant significant assets and possible disputes about money. The couple's accounts confirmed the recent influx, but they also showed nothing out of place. No sudden withdrawals, no signs of financial distress. Preliminary evidence suggested robbery was not the motive. Detectives then pivoted to telecommunication records. Working with carriers, they pulled call logs from the Sutton household landline and from associated cell numbers. In 2004, sector data could place a call within a rough radius of a tower. That meant investigators could see if any unusual activity clustered near the Sutton home at the time of the shooting. What they found stood out. Susan's cell phone showed no outgoing activity that night. John's likewise was silent. Negative evidence matters in forensic analysis. On a night of chaos, the absence of emergency calls until the 911 dispatch came in suggested the attack was fast, leaving no time for a victim to reach a phone. The search extended beyond the immediate family. Detectives subpoenaed records of close associates, including professional contacts and individuals known to visit the Sutton home. Working theories required data. Who might have known about the settlement? Who had access to the property? Who had spoken to the victims in the days leading up to the shooting? One name surfaced early in whispers: Teddy Montoto, John's longtime colleague. He had worked cases with John and was also close to Susan. Financial scrutiny showed no direct link. No unexplained transfers, no debts. Phone records placed him at a separate location, confirmed by multiple calls bouncing off towers far from Coral Gables at the critical window. It was a working alibi that held. Still, investigators logged his connection carefully. Close personal relationships often complicate clean conclusions. Forensic accountants also reviewed insurance policies. The Suttons held standard coverage, but nothing extraordinary. No new policies had been filed before the crime. That closed off one potential financial motive. Investigators had to look at a broader perimeter. Who stood to gain, not from insurance, but from control of future inheritance? That question wasn't answered yet, but the financial probe had narrowed the field. Meanwhile, forensic analysis of call detail records revealed a secondary anomaly. A cell number tied to a young associate of the Sutton family had shown unusual bursts of activity in the days before the shooting. Many of the calls were to a tight cluster of contacts, short in length but frequent. On the night of the attack, the pattern stopped completely. For investigators, silence at a critical moment was as telling as noise. In procedural terms, Chapter 3 marked a shift. The crime scene had spoken through casings and silence. Now the records spoke through absence and alignment. Financial stability removed robbery from the list. Insurance removed quick payout as motive. Call records ruled out some, left others uncomfortably aligned with the timeline. Every layer brought the investigation closer to motive and identity, but still not close enough to file charges. The investigators knew they had to expand beyond data points. They needed to understand the victims themselves, the history of relationships inside and outside the Sutton home. That step, the victimology, would be the next pivot. Victimology began within hours. Detectives built a profile of John and Susan Sutton that moved beyond photographs of a quiet home and into routine, risk, and relationships. John's recent civil victory had brought a large settlement and new attention to the family. Susan managed the home and kept a close social circle. Together, they represented stability in Coral Gables. In homicide work, stability is not a shield, it is a baseline. Anything that deviates from that baseline becomes actionable. The first pass was day-to-day life. Investigators documented the couple's habits, when lights usually went off, where phones were kept, how the dog was contained, which doors were commonly used. The sliding door that likely served as access was not an exotic route for them. It was familiar. That mattered. The attack did not require defeating a deadbolt or shattering glass. The intruder exploited normal behavior. When a crime relies on predictability, detectives look for someone who understood that predictability well. Next came professional contacts. John's practice was successful and sometimes aggressive, but his current docket did not suggest an enemy ready to stage a home invasion. The recent settlement was recorded and well known in legal circles. Prosecutors later described the win as significant. The amount turned the Sutton name into shorthand for money and play. Still, conflicts tied strictly to litigation usually produce threats, paper disputes, or reputational attacks. None of that was present here. There were no credible threats in the record that forecast a targeted shooting. Detectives then turned to the social layer. Interviews with friends and colleagues narrowed the focus to a person many already knew. Teddy Montoto, John's longtime law partner, a figure who was already part of the Suttons' daily life. In private, he acknowledged a relationship with Susan. That disclosure reoriented the interview list because intimacy can create access, and access can explain an unlocked slider and quiet entry. But interviews do not equal guilt. They open lanes of inquiry. Investigators requested corroboration for Montoto's whereabouts during the window of the attack. Phone activity, witness confirmations, and location checks were reviewed in sequence. The results kept pointing away from him. His calls were placing off the relevant sector, his timeline held, and a later firearms check did not link his weapons to the casings at the Sutton home. The elimination was not casual. It was layered, the way it has to be when a case may go to trial. With that lane closing, detectives returned to the victim's history. They documented the adoption of Christopher Sutton, the household dynamic as he grew older, and the decision years earlier to enroll him in a behavioral program in Samoa. Victimology does not label a treatment decision as a cause of violence, but it records stress points that may later interact with motive. The report noted disagreements over money and independence. None of this was charged language. It was a factual map of where tension had existed. The purpose was not to accuse, only to narrow who might understand the house, the routines, and the value attached to the Sutton name. Phone data from the period, strictly call records and cell site sector hits, was placed alongside this human map. The earlier finding held, the Sutton phones went quiet at the crucial window, consistent with a rapid attack. But numbers around the family did not go quiet. A small set of contacts showed compressed activity in the days around the shooting and then a distinct drop immediately after. Patterns like that can be innocent. They can also mark coordination. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. The line went into the working notes to remind the team not to overread coincidences until statements and physical evidence catch up. Detectives also examined the family's perimeter for access knowledge. Who had been at the house recently, who understood the layout, and who knew the dog would not trigger alarm or commotion. Contractors, neighbors, and close friends were interviewed with the same standardized questions. No one described casing, no one reported new faces loitering, and no one had noticed missing keys or tampered locks. It kept circling back to the idea of familiarity. Someone who did not have to guess which door would open and which hallway led straight to the bedroom. The medical examiner's work added context without theatrics. Multiple gunshot wounds were documented for Susan. The findings matched the casing's pattern and indoor trajectories already logged by crime scene technicians. John's injuries, stabilized by hospital staff the night of the shooting, were consistent with the initial reconstruction that he turned toward the hallway when shots were fired. The timeline this created was short. It left no space for a confrontation, no argument, no demand for valuables. The attack sequence was built for speed. From a community perspective, that mattered. In towns like this one, murders aren't just crimes. They place fear inside routine. People asked whether the case was random. The forensic answer at this stage was no. The lack of forced entry, the absence of theft, the clean access route, and the compressed shooting window supported a targeted assault. The pressure on detectives increased because a targeted assault implies a targeter, and targeters are often connected to victims by money, resentment, or both. Investigators returned to the couple's recent financial life and put the settlement into a timeline. Friends talked about celebrations and plans for the future. Law partners described how high-profile civil wins change expectations. People call more, ask for help more, and sometimes attach themselves to the glow of success. The case file built around that reality, but stayed disciplined. No claim of motive entered the record without proof to back it. As the fourth chapter of this investigation closed, the escalations were evident. Montoto's pathway had been tested and, forensically, set aside. The house had yielded a tight behavioral profile, an offender who moved with purpose and familiarity, not chaos. The family history introduced stress markers that investigators could not ignore, including the prior placement in Samoa and long-running disputes about money and control. The call patterns at the edges of the family circle remained the most promising thread. To convert patterns into charges, detectives would need a bridge, a person, a weapon, or a statement that connected the digital lattice to the brass in the bedroom. That bridge was about to appear, not from a theory, but from a seizure in a separate encounter that would produce a handgun and a name already present in the phone records. The case was moving from implication toward corroboration. The turn from suspicion to prosecutable theory usually arrives when fragmented lines of inquiry converge. In the Sutton case, that convergence came through an unplanned arrest. Weeks after the attack, police in Miami stopped a young man named Garrett Kopp on an unrelated charge. A handgun recovered from him was tested and, within days, linked by ballistics to the casings recovered inside the Sutton bedroom. This was the first hard bridge, a weapon in evidence, a suspect in custody, and a direct tie to the crime scene. Once the gun spoke, the phone records that investigators had been holding in reserve began to fit. Kopp's number had appeared around Christopher Sutton in the weeks leading up to the crime. The call records showed contact clustered before the shooting and a steep drop afterward. For detectives, the alignment was significant: the gun, the call pattern, and the presence of motive inside the family circle. Still, law enforcement could not advance without more than phone traffic. Kopp was interrogated under controlled conditions. At first, he denied knowing anything about Coral Gables or the Sutton home. But as the evidence was presented in sequence, ballistics first, then the call records, his resistance weakened. Ultimately, he admitted entering the Sutton residence and discharging the weapon. He stated he had not acted alone. That disclosure expanded the case from a single gunman to a conspiracy. Prosecutors from Mur.d.ered and federal advisors reviewed the interview transcripts. Under Florida law, corroboration was essential. A confession unsupported by other evidence would not stand on its own. Fortunately, Kopp's statement contained verifiable details: the layout of the Sutton home, the location of the sliding door, and the position of John and Susan in the bedroom. Each point matched findings from the initial scene work. This gave prosecutors confidence that the statement could survive defense challenges. The interagency component was critical. Coral Gables police led the local investigation, but Mur.d.ered homicide analysts provided technical review of the call data, while ATF specialists confirmed the firearms chain of custody and traced its origin. Federal prosecutors were consulted on potential interstate implications of conspiracy and firearms transport. By structuring the case across agencies, the state ensured the eventual charging decision would not collapse under claims of procedural gaps. Attention then turned back to Christopher Sutton. The records showed that his contact with Kopp spiked in the days before the murder. Financial review added another layer. Investigators discovered that Christopher, while not yet in line to directly control his father's legal earnings, had expressed interest in life insurance and trust disbursements. This connected motive to opportunity. John's survival, while a medical success, complicated the plan. Prosecutors theorized that the intent had been double homicide for financial gain. John's survival converted the case into a murder and attempted murder file, but the underlying conspiracy remained intact. The challenge was making the case prosecutable without overextending. Defense attorneys in similar crimes often argue that the triggerman acted alone, motivated by robbery or impulse, while their client was dragged in by association. To preempt this, prosecutors layered the evidence. Kopp's confession, the cell site patterns, corroborated knowledge of the Sutton home, and Christopher's financial interest. The theory was not speculative, it was cumulative. Each piece by itself might be argued away, but together they produced a chain that was difficult to break. Community impact was not forgotten. In Coral Gables, the Suttons had represented not only professional success, but also civic visibility. The idea that their adopted son could be tied to the crime added an element of betrayal that prosecutors knew would weigh heavily with a jury. Yet careful language in the charging documents avoided inflaming emotion. The case was built on evidence, not outrage. That distinction mattered both for due process and for eventual appellate review. By the time charges were filed, the pathway was clear. Garrett Kopp as the triggerman, Christopher Sutton as the planner and instigator. The charging theory rested on conspiracy to commit murder, actual homicide in Susan's case, and attempted homicide in John's. The interagency structure provided stability. Each element of evidence had been independently reviewed and confirmed. The case moved from a mystery to a formal prosecution file. The human cost remained obvious. Susan Sutton was dead, John Sutton was permanently blinded, and the family name was now embedded in one of Florida's most chilling domestic crime cases. For investigators, the transition to charging did not end the work. It only opened the next phase: trial preparation. Every confession had to be transcribed, every call log authenticated, and every financial record aligned so the narrative would withstand months of courtroom scrutiny. In the years following the August 2004 shooting in Coral Gables, Florida, the investigation reached the point where prosecutors believed they could finally present a complete theory of the crime. John Sutton had survived but would never regain his sight. His wife Susan had died instantly that night in their bedroom. The police had ruled out forced entry, and early suspicion directed at family friend Teddy Montoto had collapsed once his alibi was confirmed. That left one path: the conspiracy that tied the couple's adopted son Christopher Sutton to his longtime associate Garrett Kopp. By 2010, the Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office prepared for trial with a body of evidence that was procedural, documented, and consistent. The courtroom in Miami carried a clinical atmosphere. Prosecutors laid out the timeline. Late evening on August 22, 2004, a gunman entered the Sutton home firing multiple shots. Susan died at the scene. John survived with permanent injuries. Working evidence included cell phone call records between Christopher and Garrett around the hours before and after the shooting. Investigators testified that there had been no sign of forced entry, no alarm triggers, and no defensive struggle. This negative evidence aligned with a theory that the shooter was expected or allowed entry. Jurors heard testimony from Garrett Kopp himself. Facing his own charges, he admitted under oath that Christopher Sutton had orchestrated the plan, providing the firearm and the motive: financial gain from his father's pending legal settlements and long-standing resentment from being sent to a reform program in Samoa years earlier. Kopp's account was corroborated by phone logs, corroborated by firearm tracing, and by the absence of any alternative suspects with motive or access. Defense counsel tried to challenge credibility by highlighting Kopp's deal with prosecutors, but the convergence of physical and digital evidence reduced those arguments. Forensic specialists outlined how the bullets recovered from the Sutton home matched the weapon Kopp surrendered. Analysts also testified to the consistency of call records that placed both men in contact during critical windows. The case avoided speculation and returned to documents, logs, and witness testimony. Prosecutors emphasized that the working theory was not circumstantial alone. It was reinforced by confirmed admissions from the accomplice and the broader pattern of Christopher's hostility toward his adoptive parents. The jury reached a verdict after deliberations that reflected the seriousness of the crime. In 2010, Christopher Sutton was convicted of first-degree murder for the killing of his mother, Susan Sutton, and attempted murder of his father, John Sutton. He received a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. Garrett Kopp, who had testified against him, was sentenced separately to 30 years in prison. The verdict closed the procedural arc of the case. No alternative theory of the crime was sustained, and the evidence chain was consistent from scene to conviction. In summary, the trial concluded with Christopher Sutton held accountable as the architect of the plot, Garrett Kopp confirmed as the shooter, and the Sutton family left permanently altered by betrayal and violence. The outcome reaffirmed the principle that family connections do not shield individuals from responsibility when a crime is planned and executed with lethal intent. Ending. Susan Sutton deceased at scene, John Sutton permanently blinded but survived, Christopher Sutton sentenced to life without parole, Garrett Kopp sentenced to 30 years. A Florida crime that exposed the ultimate fracture within a family. When the jury foreperson delivered the life sentence for Christopher Sutton in 2010, the courtroom felt settled but not relieved. The justice system had spoken, yet the family and the Coral Gables community were left with a story that would always feel unfinished. This was not a crime committed by strangers. It was a crime carried out within the boundaries of family, a betrayal that the surviving parent would carry every day. John Sutton, already robbed of his sight on the night of the attack, had to reconcile with the four investigators and prosecutors. The case demonstrated the weight of working through procedural detail without relying on dramatic confessions alone. The evidence chain, call records, firearm matches, corroborating testimony, held through appeals and scrutiny. Every log and every physical exhibit had to withstand challenges in court. This was not what followed after sentencing was quieter but significant. Garrett Kopp began serving his 30-year prison term, his cooperation reducing but not erasing his punishment. Christopher Sutton entered the state correctional system with no chance of parole. John Sutton, though physically impaired, continued his law practice with support, embodying a resilience that many noted in the years after the trial. The professional community in Florida remarked on the endurance required not only to survive the crime, but to continue functioning in the shadow of such loss. The broader legacy of the case extended into how law enforcement treated intrafamily homicide conspiracies. Detectives testified later in training sessions that the Sutton case illustrated the importance of not dismissing family as suspects simply because of assumed loyalty. The absence of forced entry, the negative evidence of alarm triggers, and the consistency of digital records built a model for future investigations. It reminded agencies that motive can often be hidden in family resentments and financial disputes, even when outward appearances suggest stability. From a human perspective, the story left an enduring mark. Viewers and readers who encounter the case often pause at the reality that Susan Sutton's life was taken in her own home, not by an outsider, but as the outcome of a plan set in motion by the person she raised. The moral weight of that fact remains one of the most haunting aspects of the case. It invites questions of trust, accountability, and the fragility of domestic safety. As we close the record on this crime, the facts are consistent and the ending is fixed. Susan Sutton is deceased, John Sutton is permanently blind but alive, Christopher Sutton is serving life without parole, and Garrett Kopp is serving a 30-year sentence. There are no alternate versions, no unresolved disappearances, and no second ending. What remains is a Florida crime that stands as both a cautionary tale and a reminder of how thorough investigative work can bring clarity, even in the most intimate betrayals. The court's orders in 2010 did more than assign punishment. They fixed the public record of what happened inside a Coral Gables bedroom on an August night in 2004. By then, the investigation had already proved what the scene implied from the beginning. This was a deliberate crime carried out with purpose, not a random intrusion. The verdicts converted years of forensic work, casings, sector hits, interviews, sworn statements, into a single, clear conclusion that could stand outside the heat of speculation. From that moment forward, the Sutton case ceased to be an open question and became a reference point. Finality in a homicide case is administrative as well as moral. Judgments and sentences were entered. Custody designations followed. The evidence remained secured under property control as required by Florida procedure. Transcripts, logs, and exhibits joined the permanent file, so any later review would find a complete chain from 911 dispatch through verdict. Nothing about that paperwork is dramatic, but it matters. The integrity of a homicide file rests on mundane discipline, dates, signatures, and custody seals that outlast memory. For the surviving victim, legal closure did not mean personal repair. John Sutton continued his life and work while living with permanent blindness inflicted within minutes at his own bedside. He became, in the strictest sense, the central witness to the harm, proof that survival is not the absence of loss. In communities like Coral Gables, where the expectation of safety is part of daily routine, this case recalibrated what secure means. Locks matter, alarms matter, but so do patterns and access. The house was not attacked by a stranger crashing through a door. It was entered quietly by someone who understood the path to the bedroom. Law enforcement took its own lessons forward. Negative evidence, no forced entry, no theft, was not a gap. It was direction. Cell site records, though blunt by today's standards, were enough when layered with call timing and corroboration. A recovered handgun provided the link ballistics needed. An accomplice's statement was not taken on faith. It was tested against scene facts that had been documented without narrative flourish on the first night. That is how prosecutors insulated the case from defense claims that a confession had been shaped or incentivized. The facts matched the room, and the room never changed. Families who follow true crime often ask what could have prevented a result like this. Prevention seldom lives in a single decision. Intra-family conspiracies build over time through resentments, opportunism, and access. One practical takeaway, unsentimental but useful, is to treat significant financial events, legal windfalls, inheritances, major policy changes, as moments to update security and review who knows what, who has keys, and who understands schedules. It is not about suspicion for its own sake. It is about acknowledging that familiarity can be a vulnerability. Media attention made the case widely known, but the coverage did not create the outcome. The outcome came from method. Investigators preserved the scene, prosecutors insisted on corroboration, and the court instructed a jury on the law. Nothing new had to be invented to reach the verdict. The system worked because the record was built carefully enough to be trusted. In a period before smartphone GPS and ubiquitous surveillance, that mattered. The tools available in 2004, call records, tower sectors, firearm comparison, standard interviews, were sufficient when used in sequence and without shortcuts. There is also the human record that does not appear on a docket sheet. Susan Sutton's absence in the years after sentencing, the daily cost to a spouse who survived, the neighbors who still remember the patrol lights on a quiet block. Those details do not change the legal conclusions, but they explain why the conclusions matter. A homicide file is more than a set of exhibits. It is a public answer to a private loss. When the answer is supported by evidence and delivered through due process, it offers the nearest thing to justice the law can give. The name that troubled the case at the start, Teddy Montoto, belongs in the file for a different reason. It demonstrates why elimination is as important as accusation. Early suspicion focused on him because intimacy and access demand scrutiny. The investigation did what it must do in every serious crime. Test the story, check the calls, verify the location, compare the weapons, and then, when the data points refuse to align, remove the name. Cleared suspects are not footnotes. They are proof the process is working. What remains is straightforward. The murder of Susan Sutton and the attempted murder of John Sutton were planned and executed, and the planners and shooter were held accountable. The path from the sliding door to the master bedroom is set in testimony and exhibits. The motive spoke through money and old resentments, not through an argument on the night of the attack. The case does not ask the audience to fill gaps with theories. It asks them to examine how ordinary facts, unlocked access, a pattern of calls, a weapon recovered later, became enough when placed in order. If there is a final message, it is small and practical. Respect the quiet anomalies in your own routine. Update access when circumstances change. Assume that transparency inside a family is healthy but not immune from misuse. Most households will never face what the Suttons faced, but diligence, the unglamorous kind, still prevents opportunities for those who would turn familiarity into leverage. This report ends where the evidence ended, without second versions or alternate endings. The house in Coral Gables is no longer an active scene. The case is no longer an active file. The record is the record. Looking back on this crime, I'm reminded how quickly trust and routine can be turned against us. No one ever thinks danger will walk into their own home, yet the Sutton case proved that even the safest neighborhoods are not immune. As someone who has walked you through this story, I leave you with this. Protect what matters, stay alert to quiet changes, and never take safety for granted. What do you believe is the strongest safeguard for families today? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share where you're watching from, or let me know what struck you most. And if this story gave you something to think about, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next true crime case.